All right, so we've now made it possible for our front end to send data to our back end through a WebSocket. So the next thing we're going to take a look at here is really integrating WebSockets into our front end, right? Because currently the way that we have our note detail page set up isn't really using WebSockets, right? We're still using the notes that are originally loaded from the server endpoint, and we're still making this save changes request to the server when the button is clicked. Now, essentially what this Save Changes button is going to do with WebSockets, since we're already going to be making those changes automatically every time a user types a key, this button is really going to be more of a done editing button, right? Or a finished editing. So let's actually change that button now. We're going to go down to our JSX here, and we're going to change this to done editing. And we're going to make this on click. All this is going to do is set is editing to false, right? So we'll say set is editing to false, right? Because we've already got all of the updates that we've been sending through the WebSocket. Okay, so now if we go back, we'll just see that done editing just reverts everything back to normal, and we can safely delete this save changes method that we had before. The next thing that we're going to do is, instead of getting the notes from our notes context here, we're instead going to get the individual note that we're editing, right? We're going to get all of the data for that note by using this socket.io connection that we're getting here. So essentially what we can do is, when our server senses that a new connection has been established with it, it can automatically send that note's data through whatever connection was just established, right? So this will look something like this. Once the client connects, we're going to say socket.emit, and we're going to emit an event called something like initial data or initial note data, something like that, with the data from the note. Now, we are going to have to load that from the database. But one thing I do want to point out here is that this socket.emit is the other side of that connection, right? This is the backend side, and saying socket.emit here is going to send this data specifically to whatever connection, whatever client just established this connection. All right, so socket.emit initial note data, and we're going to have to load this data, of course, with our notes DB. So let's import that up at the top. We're going to have initialize DB connection and notes DB. And inside this callback here, we're going to say const note equals, and then we're going to say await notes DB dot find one. And right here, we run into a little bit of a problem, right? In other words, we need to know which note the user is actually looking at. This connection will be established no matter what note the user is looking at on the client side. So what we're going to need to do is not just include some extra data with an event that we're emitting from the front end, but we're going to need to include extra data when we're actually establishing the connection. All right, so if we go back to our note detail page, essentially we're going to have to pass some extra data when we create this new connection, and we can do that by just including a second argument, which is an object here, when we call socket.io client. All right, now if we wanted to pass the note's ID, we can simply say note ID, just like that. In fact, we don't even need to put it on its own line. So that will make this accessible in our server when a new connection is established. What we're going to do is get that note ID from the socket that just connected. And the way that we do that is by saying const note ID equals socket.handshake.query. Right? So this is sort of the equivalent here of request.body or request.params or request.query in an express callback, right? This is the socket.io version of that sort of behavior. So now that we have the note ID, we're going to find the note by its ID. And to do that, we just say ID, note ID. And once we have the note, we're going to send it back to the user in this initial note data. And for that, we can say note, and the client side will be able to access that right away. Okay, now one last thing to make this work, we're going to have to make this asynchronous, and that's perfectly fine with socket.io. You can have asynchronous callbacks. And back in our note detail page now, we're going to have to actually listen for that event. So we can say, after we've established our socket connection, socket.on, and we're going to say initial note data, which is the event name that we came up with there. And the argument here is going to be the note itself. And then what we're going to do is say set note to note. Now, we don't actually have this set note thing yet. What we're going to need to do is go up here and remove all of the logic for basically filtering out the note from our notes here. We're going to just get rid of this here. Okay, so no more note. What we're going to do instead is create a state variable of the note. So we're going to say const note and set note equals use state. And the initial value of this is going to be, you can pick null or undefined. I'm just going to use null. And we can also remove this console log, which I don't think is supposed to be there. I think I meant to remove that probably a few sections ago. All right, and here we can just put this note up here, I suppose. And we should be able to delete notes, shared notes, and update note. We don't need any of those any longer inside our note detail page because of our new socket logic. And let's see, what else do we need to change here? I think that should be all we need to do. So let's try this thing out. And again, what should be happening is when our note detail page is first opened, it should connect to our server with a socket connection. And our server should send back initial note data, which we'll be listening for at that point from this socket.on listener that we've created. And just to make this easier for ourselves, let's also log out this note here. We're going to say, there we go. We'll say set note, and we'll also log out the note as well. Okay, so console.log note. And let's go back to here, and this isn't looking good. Let's try refreshing. And okay, let's open up the inspector and see what's going on here. So we see that it's logging out null here, which means that either the server isn't finding that note in the database, or we're not accessing this data in the correct way. So to check this, let's go into our server, and let's log out the note when we get it. So we'll say console.log. And you know what? While we're at it, why don't we log out note ID too, just to make sure we're getting that correctly. All right, so let's go back to here now. What we're going to do is refresh the page, and let's take a look now at our server's logs. So yep, sure enough, note ID is undefined, which of course means that the note is not being found. And you know why? It's actually because I left out an extra layer of properties when we passed our note ID. This needs to say query note ID. All right, so let's go back now, and we should see the note, right? Not only is the note being displayed here, but we're also seeing it get logged out to the console here, which is exactly what we wanted to happen. So our server is sending back the initial note data here. The next thing we're going to need to do is make sure that the note actually gets updated when we receive this update note event. So what that's going to look like, instead of just logging out the console, we're going to say await notesdb.update1. And we're going to update the note with this note ID, which we already know from the initial connection. So we're going to say note ID, and that is going to be the ID property here. And for the updates, we're going to set the title and content to their new values. So we'll say $set, and this will be title and content. Okay, so that should take care of updating the note in the database on every update note event that we receive. So let's give this a try, and what we're going to do is actually try and edit this. Let's refresh our page here. Oops, it looks like we're getting some kind of error. So let's go back to our console here, and we see, we just need to add async to this callback here, all right, because we're using await. So let's try it again. We're going to refresh the page, and we see that we get our note. So let's try editing this thing, and we'll say code is really cool. And what we should see if we refresh the page is that this says code is really cool now, right? That's the exact changes we made without us having to explicitly save it at one point in time. It's just been updating as we type this. Now, one other thing we are going to have to change that I just realized is if we make changes to this and then click done editing, we see that it goes back to the way it was before because this is looking at the note. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to basically make it so that the note data is kept in sync with the updated title and updated content that we have here. And in fact, one way to do that would actually be to delete this note that we added before and instead just store the note's title and content in these state variables. So instead of saying set note note, we would say set updated title to title and set updated content to content. All right, and then down here in the JSX, instead of displaying the notes, title, and content, let's see, where is that here? So note title and note content, we're just going to say updated title and updated content. Now the updated here is a little bit redundant because this is just the only title and content that we have. So we'll just say, I mean, we can even change it to title and content if you want, but for now, I'll just say updated content, and let's make sure that's all we have here. All right, cool. So let's try this out again to see if that fixed it. We're going to go back and refresh. Oops, so it looks like we're getting note is not defined everywhere. So let's just search for note dot. And yep, sure enough, it looks like there's plenty of places where that's happening. We can actually just delete this starting value and set it to an empty string in both of our updated title and updated content. Like that. Where else are we using it? Okay, so note.title, note.content right there. In fact, we can actually remove this entire use effect hook because we now have a more robust way of dealing with this by getting back the initial note data from the server when we connect. So we'll delete that. And where else do we have it here? Okay, so these two we don't need anymore either. We're just going to delete those. And as a matter of fact, there isn't really a way to cancel right now. So let's just delete this button altogether. And we can delete this evenly spaced thing as well. So there we go, there we go. And let's take a look and see if this fixed everything. Oops, there's actually one note left. And for this, we're just going to use the note ID that we're getting from the URL parameters. Whew, that was a lot of refactoring. So hopefully you understood all of that. Let's go back to here and we'll refresh. And it looks like there are still a few that we missed. So let's just take a look at line 11 here. Okay, so for the role and for can edit, what we're going to need to do for those is actually create a member variable. So we're going to go down here. We're going to say const role and set role. And what this is going to be, we're going to say use state, and it's just going to be an empty string at first. And what we're going to do is when we actually load the note, we're going to get the role from the note by saying set role to note.role. Okay, and this is going to need to be note.title and note.content. I'm not sure if I changed that by accident. I think I might have. But that does need to be note.title, note.content. And now we have note.role. So let's see if that fixed anything. All right, we still have note is not defined on line 48. So let's check that one out here. Okay, so this one's going to be interesting to fix for our new socket flow because we're basically going to need to add another state variable here that will tell us whether or not the note was found. So what that's going to look like, we're going to add another state variable. We'll just add it down here, I guess. We'll say const is not found and set is not found. And this is initially going to be false, but we'll set it to true if the note doesn't exist. So what that's going to look like is inside our socket.on listener here, we're going to say if not note, right? If the note didn't exist, if the server sent back just a empty, something like null or undefined, what we're going to do is say set is not found to true. And we're only going to do these other things if the note was found. Okay, so there we go. And in fact, we should probably switch these around for the sake of just making it easier to read. And there we go. Okay, so we have the initial note data. Let's try refreshing this. Oops, it looks like we created one more of these things with that. So let's go to line 53 here. Oh, actually, that's the one that we had before. So we'll say if is not found, then we'll display the note not found page. Okay, so at long last, we've made our note work. So we can change this now to code is really awesome and click done editing. That will end up updating that automatically, and we can actually refresh the page now and see that those updates are persisted. Great, so what we've done here is we've pretty radically overhauled the way that our note detail page works. Instead of just loading its data initially or, filtering out its data from pre-existing data on our front end, we're actually creating a connection to the server. We're getting initial data back from the server, and whenever we edit either one of these pieces of data, the server automatically receives those updates and stores them in the database. So that's a huge architectural change that we've just created there. And to be honest, even though that might have seemed like a bit of a long time for refactoring, it's actually quite fast considering the scale of what we just did. So you can give yourself a pat on the back if you were following along for all of that. If you weren't following along, you can still give yourself a pat on the back because why not? So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.